Hey everyone, welcome to the beginning of our last unit of biology, Unit 5, Evolution. And this unit is always at the end of the year because we're really going to tie in a lot of the concepts that we've learned throughout the year in order to understand how life has evolved on Earth and how it's continuing to evolve and change even right now, even as we speak. So let's get into lesson 5.1, the first lesson of the unit, and that is called Darwin's evolution. So just like we have Gregor Mendel to thank for all of the principles of genetics, we have another man named Charles Darwin who we thank for discovering the principles of evolution. So it was actually in 1859, really long time ago, that Charles Darwin published his book on the origin of species, in which he included two really important findings for how evolution can be the mechanism of change on Earth. And that is, number one, he proposed a specific mechanism of evolution called natural selection. And more on that in a little bit. And then number two, he also presented tons of evidence that evolution has been taking place for millions of years, and it even continues to this day in all living things. Now, this second point, the evidence of evolution, is not something we're going to talk about in lesson 1. That's actually going to be lesson 2. But that was a really important piece of this book because if you think about 1859, at that time, there was not a lot of science that was being done. So a lot of people really questioned what Darwin had to say about evolution and about species change. So that evidence was really important. And again, we're going to get into the evidence tomorrow. But let's talk about point number 1 first, which is what is natural selection? So in order to understand what natural selection is, we need to understand two other terms, inherited variation and artificial selection. So inherited variation is what we studied in our last unit. It means that members of each species vary from one another in important ways. So the genetics of species are different. They're varied. You don't have the same traits as even your siblings, unless you're identical twins. All living things vary. So Darwin noted that even in plant and animal species, the farmers of the time would only breed the ones that had desirable traits. So they would breed the largest hogs or pigs, the fastest horses, and the cows that produced the most milk. They would also plant the vegetables that had the best traits, like the sweetest tasting apples or the most producing corn. All of those things were selected for. And that is what Darwin called artificial selection, meaning that farmers and breeders choose to breed only the best animals or plants. They artificially selected for the best traits, and those are the species that they continued to breed. Darwin also noticed that there was change in animals and plants besides the ones that farmers and breeders were using, that all different types of plants and animals seemed to change over time. So rather than there be a breeder involved, Darwin proposed that natural selection was occurring. It's similar to artificial selection, except that nature is selecting for the traits that would succeed. Now, the way that nature does this is through the struggle for existence. And a way to define the struggle for existence is that organisms need to compete to survive. So not all animals, or plants for that matter, that are produced are going to survive to reproduce themselves. There's a competition in nature. And you can see two examples of competition here in the notes. We've got two males fighting for a mate in these, they look like reindeer species. And then we also have fighting for survival, this gazelle as it's running away from the cheetah. The cheetah also has to be fast enough to get the gazelle in order to eat and survive itself. So organisms need to compete to survive. Only those that are the most fit will survive. So you may have heard this term before, survival of the fittest. The ability of an individual to survive and reproduce in its specific environment is called its fitness. So the more able an organism is to survive, the more fit we would say. That doesn't mean fit like has muscles, goes to the gym. That means fit as in is well suited to its environment and can survive in its environment. And it's able to survive in these environments as a result of adaptations. An adaptation is any inherited characteristic that increases an organism's chance of survival. So 2 examples here, we've got the stick bug, which is this whole creature here. This is actually a bug, an insect, that has adapted to blend well with its environment so that it doesn't get eaten. We have the same thing in this other picture is another insect. This is the head up here, and then the arms, and then here's the whole body. This other insect, that's the leg, is very well adapted to blend in with its environment as well. So those would be considered adaptations that increase these species' fitness. So because of the similarities to artificial selection, Darwin coined the term natural selection to refer to the survival of the fittest, that nature is selecting the traits that are going to cause that organism to succeed. So we have 3 more examples here. We've got a butterfly blending in with the plant, another one blending in with some leaves, and then this frog toad that is also blending in with the ground around it. Now, one thing that, a lot of people talk about when they talk about evolution is the fact that, humans evolved from monkeys, which isn't exactly correct, or that all living things evolved from one living thing at the beginning of time, which is actually the case. So if we compile what we're talking about right now with natural selection and survival of the fittest, you can actually trace back a bunch of smaller changes that occurred because of nature over time, can actually be traced back to one common ancestor of all living things on the earth. And this is what Darwin calls descent with modification. So natural selection produces changes as organisms develop different structures, establish different niches. If you remember back in ecology, a niche is an organism's role in the environment, and occupy different habitats, a place where an organism lives. So each living species has descended with changes from other species over time. And this is the principle of descent with modification. And you'll see in a video you're going to watch for an Edpuzzle that as these species change over time, they branch off, become new species, but all living things can be traced back to that common species. And that's because these species follow 4 principles of natural selection. All living things that change follow these 4 principles. The first is overproduction. So more individuals have to be produced or born each generation than can survive and live to adulthood. The second is biodiversity or variation, meaning that there is some type of variation among individuals, and that variation has to be inherited. And we know that that's the case with genetics, that variations are inherited through meiosis and the production of different gametes and fertilization. The third one is that survival of the fittest occurs when individuals that are better suited to their environment are the ones that survive and pass on those stronger traits. And then the last one is reproductive isolation. So when species have enough changes over time that they are no longer able to reproduce with members of the previous species, that is what we call reproductive isolation. And that is the point when a new species is going to form. And we have more on that in a later section. All right, well, that's the end of our notes for lesson 5.1. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about, 2 days from now, we're going to be talking about lesson 5.2, which is evidence for evolution. Thanks for listening.